I also wanted to share with you that we have this at the library with many events that go on in the month of August, so please pick one up on your way out. So that kept aside some more housekeeping that we have. In the event of an emergency, I did want to let you know that our exit is not through the patio, so please don't go through this door. Please make sure you exit out this way really our exit is through the ramp, so it's through our children's store, which is closest to us here. It's just towards the back. So if there is just some housekeeping, just don't go through here. That would not be a good idea. And so other than that, thank you for coming. Enjoy the talk. And I'll let you go ahead and take it away, Mr. Dennis McNally.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
I could be the traditional guy that says, now it would be a very good time to put phones on vibrate and so forth and so on. But probably I don't need to say that. On cue. I love libraries. I think libraries are the best thing in human civilization, and librarians. And I don't think I've done a talk in a library before, which again is like, what took me so long. But anyway, thank you for having me, and thank you for the library being here. And it's so nice that we're 2 blocks from Jer's old place. I have done a lot of speaking in colleges and whatnot about the Grateful Dead, and more recently I even opened for doing a short kind of comic set where I just got to the jokes right away, and it tended, as I said, to be toward the funny, because God knows Life with the Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia was pretty funny. This will be a mix of things. There's going to be a fair amount of, there's going to be a few stories about Jerry. But I got a doctorate, and I'm the first time I saw San Francisco in 1974. I've told this story. My wife is going to sit there and say, "God, how many times has he told this story?" I literally had been in the city for about 5 minutes. I was being taken by the guy we were freeloading on. I was in San Francisco to research my book about Jack Kerouac, which is called Desolate Angel. And we were going up over Russian Hill towards Sam Wo's in Chinatown. And I looked around and I said, how much do apartments around here go for? And 2 years later, I moved in 2 or 3 blocks from where I asked the question. I fell in love with, what I'm trying to say is I fell in love with San Francisco the same day. And it's something I had very much in common with Jerry. So who was Jerry Garcia? I wrote as a great first sentence. He was skeptical. He was cynical. He was not attached to any dominant values. He was extremely tolerant. He was extremely kindly. He was compassionate when it was called for. He also was totally willing to take part in 19-year-old boys in a locker room humor, which really was the predominant humor form of the Grateful Dead. One thing he wasn't was sentimental, except on one subject, and that was San Francisco. He loved San Francisco. He loved being a San Franciscan. He loved what San Francisco stood for. He recognized that he was part of a tradition that, among other things, is what I call the Bohemian tradition, and it goes back to Thoreau and Mark Twain, who was a Bohemian here. He straightened out after he left, like so many people do. In 1993, the dastardly fiends of the greater Tampa, St. Petersburg area, or at least 3 or 4 of them, attempted to kidnap the San Francisco Giants and steal them and take them to Tampa. Local people stopped, nipped that in the bud. And the new ownership, a guy named Peter McGowan, led by a guy named Peter McGowan, then hired a promising young lad named Barry Bonds away from Pittsburgh. And on opening day, 1993, the Grateful Dead, having been invited, sang the national anthem. Now, this is very peculiar for a number of reasons. A, it was the first time, this was now the 25-year history, 28-year history of the Grateful Dead, that they'd ever sung the national anthem. Well, let me tell you something. There are two facts. There are two things that every aspiring musician has to learn. One is that you will have to do benefits, and the other is that you will have to sing the national anthem. It's just part of the deal. The Grateful Dead somehow managed to duck that for any number of reasons, and it says quite a lot about them. But though he was, that day we did a press conference, and somebody asked Jerry if he was a serious sports fan, and he said, well, no, not really. I can't take the extra anxiety. But toward the end when it starts getting good, I'll jump on. And what I really am is a fan of San Francisco. And actually, I will also mention that one of my Jerry stories, and a true one. We were in Philadelphia, and the Niners were playing the New York Giants, and we were not good that day. This was in the the glory days when we were always good. We weren't so hot that day, and I was like screaming at the television for most of the afternoon, and finally, at the very last possible second, Joe Montana throws something to Jerry Rice, who slips about 3 defenders and races 70 yards for a touchdown. Niners win. Happy, happy, happy. Which was in perfect time, because by now it's 4 o'clock and time to get down to the first van ride over to the gig. And I get in the van, and as it was the first one, which was my pattern, and Jerry gets in, which is his pattern. He always wanted to get there first, and you could see the dark cloud over his head. He was just pissed, which is not a common state of affairs. And after a while, I said, see the end of the game? And he said, no. It sucked so bad I couldn't stand it. I said, well, then it's too bad, because you missed Jerry scoring the touchdown and we won. And he went, really? Lightened up. I mean, you could watch the clouds sort of part. And played a hell of a show that night, I think. I was like making mental notes. Pay attention, because his mood, it was fascinating. So let's talk about San Francisco very quickly. It has always been more than a little bit of a fantasy. Before there was a San Francisco, before there was a state of California, before there was anything in terms of Western so-called civilization, I use this term very loosely, on the western coast of what we now think of as North America, a guy named Garcia Rodriguez de Montalvo published a story called The Adventures of the Very Zealous Knight Esplandian, son of the great King Amadis of Gaul. It was a fantasy, and in this fantasy there is a Garden of Eden, an earthly paradise, and he called it California. Of course, and it was, I might add, it was ruled by Amazons, which I always thought was anticipated Berkeley just a little bit by about 500 years, but good in spirit. I just find that hilarious. I mean, this is before the first explorer, managed to part the fog and come in through the Golden Gate. At least 3 of them went whipping by, including Sir Francis Drake. Never saw San Francisco. He had to find Bodega. And it was named, I might also add, of course, for St. Francis of Assisi. And I would just like to add that of all the saints, and with all my problems, my name is McNally after all, with the Roman Catholic Church, St. Francis of Assisi is one of the saints that's really hard to argue with. The prayer of St. Francis is truly, read it. Good reading. It's highly recommended. So people came here. Even before, I might add, the gold rush. In 1839, so 10 years before the gold rush, the alcalde, whose name was Dejaro, in case you wonder where the Dejaro Street over in Potrero Hill comes from, commissioned the grocer, whose name was Viogé, who's French, but who had some survey experience, to do a survey which basically covered Montgomery, the 4 blocks of Montgomery, Sacramento, DuPont Guy, which of course became Grant Avenue, and Pacific Streets. And he laid that out in 1839. Keep in mind that those 4 little streets started the pattern that became San Francisco. And then, of course, they figured out Market Street and set a countervailing 45-degree opposite pattern for the south of Market. But all of this was determined by this grocer based on the fact that what we now think of as Montgomery Street was, in fact, the harbor, the beach, the muddy beach. And then you get the gold rush. It was then and now and always and forevermore, San Francisco became a sanctuary for the odd and the eccentric and the home of the weird. Someday I'm going to write a book called Home of the Weird. Robinson Jeffers, one of our better poets, put it, "For our country here, at the west of things, is pregnant of dreams." And I think that pretty well catches it. You have to keep in mind, Kenneth Rexroth, who's another San Francisco poet, and very much of the tenor of the times, really from the 1930s to 70s in San Francisco, and really set the tone. Kenneth Rexroth pointed out that we all know, cities happen because of economic reasons, right? There's transportation. Denver happened because the railroad lines crossed, and to some extent, it's true. San Francisco has certainly economic reasons with the being a fine harbor and all that good stuff. But that's not why it happened. It happened because a bunch of losers, people who did not fit in China, in Chile, and in the East Coast of the United States, said, "Screw this, I'm going to go chase a fortune." They were all marginalized people. These were not, the wealthy, the established, the comfortable. It was a very uncomfortable trip to get here. You had to be hungry, and not least that for several decades. And I'll get some numbers later. I can't be precise, but for decades after the gold rush, it was it was a strongly all male, or not all male, but majority male city. It was skewed. It was weird, and it was weird in the sense that even though we had an opera and a corrupt police department, that's traditional, very traditional stuff. Corrupt political system, rada, and schools and homes and children and, all the things that cities have. There was this feeling that it was okay to be strange as long as you didn't, step on anybody's head. And it set a tone for this city. That is what the Grateful Dead was certainly all about. And before them, the Beat Generation, and after locating the Grateful Dead in the 60s, and after them, the great gay migration into San Francisco. It is a sanctuary. In particular, it's also an Asian city, which we all know. Just look at Chinatown, which is the largest outside Asia. But we face this Pacific Ocean. We are part of the Pacific Rim, and in a lot of ways, the culture of this city has paid quite as much attention to that as to look back towards the East Coast and the rest of the United States. Just as one example, 2 examples of strangeness in the city, early strangeness that is part of our lore and will last forever. Emperor Norton, many of you may know, was a guy who came out, was a stock market, very successful, lost it all, including from his ears up, and proclaimed himself emperor, wandered around in the streets. Now, it's okay. It's nice that, they tolerated him, they were nice to him. It went a little further than that. He would write out dollar bills, Emperor Norton dollar bills, and he could cash them. City, restaurants and bars would take his money. The police, there was a great story where once the police, a cop decided to be annoyed with him, and he wanted to confine him for mental testing. The chief of police ordered the cop to release him, apologize, and forever after, the cops in San Francisco saluted Emperor Norton. He just on and on. 30,000 people attended his funeral. It was a very sad day in San Francisco. I mean, and we're not talking about, we're talking about everybody, One other example, one of my favorite examples, I've been doing a lot of San Francisco history reading for this, as I say, Home of the Weird, which someday I'll have a concept of how to write. There was a guy named Abe Warner who opened a bar on Meigs Wharf, which would be basically the foot of Broadway or Pacific. It was a wharf. And he loved spiders. He loved spiders. He would not disturb spiders. And he wouldn't hurt webs. And his place became a cobweb heaven. And it was called the Cobweb, it was nicknamed and became known as the Cobweb Palace. And for 40 years, it was just one of those phenomena of San Francisco. There's people drinking, in this room surrounded by spider webs. This does not fly anywhere else. So, and then of course, the great thing, and then of course, we don't need to be told this now, but going back clearly to the turn of the century, the last turn of the century, is that it was a haven for those who were sexually nonconformist. There was, at the turn of the century, in Barbary Coast, which of course had always been a protected sex zone for commercial sex, brothels, they also had a place for female impersonators called the Dash Club. Going into the 1930s, there was a famous lesbian bar, which is really part of San Francisco's sexual history, called Mona's, and the Black Cat, which was the most famous and early of gay bars, in which a guy named Jose Sarria, who proclaimed himself Empress Norton. He had respect. Sarria had respect, and had, and it's part of the gay movement that has seen such happy developments, more recently. Here, too. So, that's just a little snippet of background about San Francisco. I could go on for hours, and you don't need it. So let's talk about Jerry and his history. I know very little about his mother's side of the family. As I was looking at this, I was going, God, he was very vague about it, and there weren't any living relatives on that side that I could find. But the Garcias we know about. Manuel Garcia was from an island in the Bay of Biscay, which is to say the north, west of the Pyrenees, north of Spain, and obviously west of France, called La Coruña. Jerry played in Barcelona in 1981, and he said he could understand everybody. Couldn't speak it. I mean, he never did learn how to speak Spanish. On the other hand, I also got a call from Hispanic Business, which was a, real kind of a cheerleading, cheerleading magazine about the success of, sort of like the Ebony of Spanish, Ebony magazine for African American. Well, this was for Hispanic type business, and they wanted to cheer about, so they had the top 10 Hispanic incomes. And they listed Jerry at $60 million or something, and I sort of fell to the floor laughing, and I called up the guy, and I said, you do realize that for starters, what you're claiming his income is the entire income of the Grateful Dead, and he has 5 partners, plus expenses. I mean, you think they keep all that stuff? Plus, oh, by the way, he didn't identify as Hispanic. He had a Spanish side, Spain, not South America, which is what they were after, south of the United States. And on his mother's side, Irish and Swedish heritage. And frankly, he thought of himself as what in his day, which is to say going back into the 40s, before Carlos Santana's family got to the mission, as Mission Irish. And which it was. The Mission District was an Irish neighborhood, say, in the 30s. And there are 2 or 3 tiny outcroppings that remain, including is it the Double Play, the baseball bar across from where Seal Stadium was, and there's another Irish bar. Susanna, what's the Irish bar with the brunch, on like 19th in York? Do you remember the name?
Oh, J&B.
The J&B. The J&B, which is as Irish as you can get. All these cop shields behind the bar. And that's sort of, some of the leftover. And there were other examples, but it was an Irish neighborhood until after World War II. As they slide into the 50s, then you get Carlos Santana's family moving onto Armory Street, and in the next 10 years, the mission becomes very Latin. So Manuel Garcia comes to San Francisco. He bought a home in the outer Mission District. And his second son, Jose, commonly called Joe, married Ruth Marie Bobby Clifford, who was a nurse. Their first child was Clifford, commonly called Tiff. He was born in 1937, and on August 1, 1942, at Children's Hospital in San Francisco, Jerome John Garcia made his first appearance. Jerome for Jerome Kern, who was Bobby's favorite composer. John for I have no idea. It was a very nice home. And Joe, who had been a musician, a reed player and a band leader, swing music, leased a tavern on the corner of First and Harrison, which was called Joe Garcia's, and was a popular bar with a very varied clientele, because it had, and it would have through the 1950s, Jerry worked there, it would have lots of working guys, seamen and longshoremen, but also it was a kitty corner from, I pulled a blank, but it's a giant oil company. And so you get executives too. It was a mix, and it was quite a place. They did very well. Garcia, Jerry, and if I say Garcia from now on, we can assume it's Jerry. When he was, one of his earliest memories, and his important memories, at the age of 4 or 5, was finding a box, a Victrola, a wind-up Victrola, and some old, really, really old records. He remembered as Sweet Betsy from Pike, but like little folk music records. And he played, and they got fascinated. He played them over and over and over again. So music was about to claim his soul, even then. Unfortunately, when Jerry was 5, Joe died. He was fishing and he drowned. Jerry actually claimed to have seen it, but I strongly think that that's sort of an adopted memory. And not so good losing your father. In addition, Bobby was not what you call domestic, and she was very artistic. She gave him a lot of stuff, and he on a good day he would recognize all this. She loved opera. She loved Chopin. She followed some of the more esoteric doctrines, like this guy Velikovsky, Madame Blavatsky, sort of theosophy and that sort of thing. She dug astrology and palm reading, all of which I might add are also threads in San Francisco's weird blanket. And as time went along after Joe died, the care of Tiff and Jerry came to be shared a lot with Jerry's grandparents, that is to say, Bobby's parents. Nan and Pop at 87 Harrington Street. And I don't know, how many people in this room have walked down Harrington Street? Well, you know, there's room. It's 2 blocks. Just keep going down Mission, hang a right. The house is on the left. And that's where the little critter grew up. In a lot of ways, you know, there was at least one occasion where he told a story where he got lost. You know, when he was new to this neighborhood, he got lost and he couldn't find his mother, and he felt extremely deserted. And kind of that feeling, unfortunately, stuck with him as far as Bobby went, really for the rest of his life. And he later said she died in 1970 after a car accident, and I don't know if any person ever feels that they ever got a chance to really, really clear things up with their parents when it's ambivalent, but he never felt closure of their relationship, and I think that damaged him really, you know, with his relationship with women always. It would also get a little more complicated because Bobby remarried at least 2 or 3 times over the next few years, and Jerry felt that was, you know, wasn't the right thing to do and dishonored Joe in some sense. And I got all this ton of material, and I knew I had too much. You know, that was obvious. Boy, do I know now even better how far, far too much I had. Very briefly, Pop, their grandfather, was a quiet guy. He liked the fights, he liked beer, and he had hobbies, and Tiff really bonded with him. You know, he had a tool shop. Tiff would follow him around in the tool shop. Tools, not so much with Jerry. Jerry thought of him as boring. Tilly Clifford, his grandmother, he loved. Tilly was the founder and the secretary-treasurer of the Laundry Workers Union in San Francisco. And this is no joke. You have to understand, in picking a date almost out of the air, say 52, Jerry's 10, San Francisco is a blue-collar union city. And I'm going to diverge from Jerry briefly, and I want to talk about the most important event in labor history, in some ways, in America, and certainly in San Francisco, and certainly in Jerry Garcia's life, because this is the San Francisco he grew up in. As I say, and he was in the middle of it, and I will tell you a story of how it affected him. In 1969, the light shows in San Francisco, not in any very effective way, decided that they were going to unionize and threatened to strike because they weren't, you know, getting enough money. Now, there's a lot of hanky-panky involved in all this and its silliness. But they had a picket line at Family Dog on the Great Highway, which is where Jerry was supposed to be playing that night. And Jerry could no more cross that picket line. I mean, at that time, I asked him about it, and he said, well, actually, at that moment, Tilly was kind of in Alzheimer's, what we would now recognize as Alzheimer's disease, and was slowly losing her vitality. But she would have found a way to, you know, she was living in the sunset. She would have found a way to kick his butt if he had even thought about crossing a picket line. He was a union child, union-made, M-A-I-D, for those of you who know the Woody Guthrie song. She was a piece of work. She once filed charges against her husband for abuse. The judge dismissed them. It's 1916. There's not a lot of, you know, spousal, you know, prosecutions of men. And she looked at the judges and said, "You're going to run again, and you're going to lose some votes because of me. You know, don't get mad, get even." She was a socialist, and Jerry said she was either a fabulous liar or she just genuinely loved everybody. She also, by the way, had a fairly loose relationship with her husband and went to out-of-town union meetings with her boyfriend. But I want to talk now about the general strike, which spiraled off the longshoremen's strike and the maritime strike of 1934. So in 34, which, to now, that's 90 years, or 80, 90 years ago. 79 years ago. I'm a little sloppy in my arithmetic. But remember, when Jerry was growing up, it was less than 20 years ago. And it was, very much the conditions he lived in. In 1934, San Francisco was population of 600,000. Only 200,000 were women, so it was still 2 to 1 men. A half white collar, half blue. 60% were foreign-born or first generation arrived. There were 82 docks. The entire city pivoted on the maritime trade. It's a very corrupt city. Both, an infinity of brothels that were, paid off for. The cops were on the take. The irony, and I especially now where we're talking about, we have this Republican Party that talks about, shrinking the government and so forth and so on. In the period between the two world wars, the American shipping industry was entirely financed by subsidy from the federal government, Republicans, because supposedly they were at a disadvantage against foreign workers. This did not extend, of course, to the sailors. The subsidies, lined the pockets of the owners. Finally, the NRA, the National Recovery Act, made it possible to start organizing unions, and immediately the dock workers, the longshoremen, and the sailors organized and declared a strike. The action was on the Embarcadero down at the foot of Market, say between the foot of Market and Bryant Streets. And it was a war. It was a war between thousands and thousands of longshoremen who were not wussy guys, and the cops who were, doing what they were told by the owners, especially a lieutenant named Thomas Hortcorn, who would be literally waving his pistol in the air and charging on strikers with gas grenades and batons. Finally, on July 8th, I bring this in for everybody here. How many people here went to Winterland? Yeah, I thought so. Well, you'd like to know. On July 8th, in the middle of all this craziness, and it had just been ongoing craziness, the Teamsters went to Dreamland, which became Winterland, to have a citywide meeting and voted for a general strike. That was on the 8th. On the 5th, there was more. The strikers had been routed from the Embarcadero and had gathered on Stewart Street. And in the course of the day, 2 strikers, one named Howard Sperry and one named Nicholas Bourdois, were killed by the police. It was called Bloody Thursday as a result. The next day, a couple of days later, 40,000 people marched behind those coffins from the Ferry Building to Duggan's Funeral Parlor, which is at 3434 17th Street. So the next time you go by it, I mean, that kind of, I went by it a million times. Reading this, I realized, it's not just your average Irish funeral parlor. This has something to do with the heart of this city. That day, the entire freaking city shut down. It was called a general strike. It is the only successful general strike. It lasted 2 days. It actually got done when it was supposed to get done. But it's the only successful general strike in the history of America. This city stood behind. And, the media, I might add, if you read any newspaper in San Francisco, they were all virtually owned by the same people who owned the steamship lines. And they were constantly saying, "Oh, the strike's over," and blah, blah, blah. the entire city backed that strike. And it's a remarkable moment in American history. Finally, about 2 weeks after all this, 10 days later, all the bosses gathered at their lawyer's house in Woodside, which seems to be an appropriate place for a lawyer to live. And they agreed to arbitration with the NRA, and the strike ended, and the longshoremen got what they wanted. So Jerry grows up in San Francisco, and from the beginning, he kept finding these people that were part of this traditional, artistic, bohemian subculture that has run through American history. And it's a wide, and I recently wrote a book which I'm trying to sell, and so I could again go on for hours, and I will spare you that. But the fact is that the bohemian, you have to understand the bohemian subculture in a very wide context. Henry David Thoreau is, for my money, the patron saint of that subculture. Henry David Thoreau died a virgin and never drank a drop. So, the normal notion that, a good, proper bohemian is out there catting around and drinking himself crazy, or herself, needs some examination. Mark Twain, on the other hand, certainly took care of the boozing and probably the wenching. Although, again, once he met the right lady, well, that was over. And he met Livy and became a proper husband for the rest of his days. Jerry had a bohemian art teacher. That's the way he described her. So she obviously wore ethnic skirts and didn't live the conventional life because she was a third-grade teacher. So it couldn't have been too wild. But she got him involved in art, which was something that he felt really always as an identity as an artist, as not being, the average person. His favorite reading was horror. It started out with the horror comics like Tales of the Crypt, which he loved till the day he died. He even wanted to during the early 90s, was it Spielberg started a Tales of the Crypt TV series, and we worked like hell to get him to direct one. He would have died a happy man if he could have directed an episode of Tales of the Crypt. In fact, another thing that happened to him at that time, in 1994, as in particular his diabetes sort of limited his life, and mood. I don't know if you've dealt with an completely untreated diabetic, but his mood swings. He never took them out on other people, but he did withdraw, be a little less outgoing. So I suspended all interviews. I mean, he didn't want to be bothered, nothing, except that I then got a request from the movie show, I think it was called I Found It at the Movies. It was, they want to know for you to talk about your first movie and how it affected your life. And I thought, well, geez, if there ever was a thing that's going to get him, this is it. And in fact, so I mentioned it to him, and he immediately did the interview for me for like half an hour, the detail. And the movie was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which he saw at the Ocean Theater, the Granada Theater at Ocean and Mission. And he started to describing, because of course he was 8 years old, and he would get scared, so he would duck down behind the seat in front of him, and he could still remember the pattern of the fabric on the back of the seat. And got involved with horror, and literally watching horror movies, really for the rest of his life. In the early 50s, Bobby remarried yet again and married a guy named Wally Matuzewitz, which did not sit well with Jerry. And in 1953, so that makes him 11. It was Union Oil, by the way, that was the executives, and they had the building kitty corner from Joe Garcia's tavern. So Union Oil in 1953 bought the old Joe Garcia's and moved it across the street. I never quite figured out which way. And it took them like a year to build a new Joe Garcia's. And in that interval, they moved to Menlo Park, which right away Jerry figured out he didn't dig suburbia. mostly his visual. I asked him about that year, and there were some good things. He had a cool teacher who drove a motorcycle. You know, that'll get your attention when you're in your early teens. But he actually, one of the things that he remembered about Menlo Park in the early 50s was racism and anti-Semitism, which just annoyed him thoroughly. And he started getting into music, first with R&B on radio station KWBR, which was the great R&B station of the Bay Area. And then rock and roll with Little Richard and you know, all that stuff. Returned. Can I have that? Returned. Thank you. Can only divert you so long. 1957. So he's now 15. He returned to San Francisco. Went to Denman and then to Balboa. But more importantly, on his 15th birthday, he got the musical instrument of his dreams. Well, first, it was an accordion. It was beautiful. He even remembered the pearl, you know, mother of pearl buttons. He thought it was gorgeous. It's not what he wanted. And he begged and cried and pleaded and moaned. And they went down to the corner of 3rd and Folsom, not very far at all from Joe Garcia's, and he got a Dan Electro guitar. Well, you know, at this point, his life path is fairly set in a lot of ways. The summer of '57 was also good for 2 other things. He started smoking cigarettes, not so good, which he kept on doing till the day he died, and marijuana, which he thought was the most hilarious experience of ever. Spent a lot of, he's at the 10th grade, in the fall of '58, he started the 10th grade at Balboa High School. At that point, Balboa was a fairly rough place. The way Jerry described it was that there were the 2 groups. There were the Barts, which is short for Black Bart, and that referred to Italians who, Fonzie with the greaser haircuts, tough guys. What was it? Rockers and Motts, so they'd be rockers, I suppose. And then but not at Balboa High School. And then there's the Shoes. The Shoes were the Pat Boone white shoe types. That's the way he remembered it, the preppies. So there were preppies and there were Barts. Jerry, of course, claimed status as a Bart because he was a tough street guy. It's certainly not going to be a shoe. But from all accounts, including his friend Laird, who he had met at Menlo High or Menlo Middle School, and who stayed his friend forever. It's fairly clear that he was a lover, not a fighter. So any of his stories about being a great street guy were Mets. Again, he spent a lot of time at this point at Joe Garcia's working as what he called pearl diving, which meant washing dishes. They serve food, obviously, and decorating the shelves, which is to say stocking, opening things, stocking. It was a very slick 50s bar, this new one. Naugahyde, a lot of Naugahyde, a lot of mirrors. But it was also the home of incredible conversations. The longshoremen and the sailors' union was across the, Union Hall was across the street, as well as braver. Well, now that it was slick, probably it was easier. The braver Union Oil executives. So the point being that everybody, it was a community, and he was part of that community. He was accepted as part of that community, and it was a verbal community. People talked, which Garcia got the habit of and continued to do so pretty much until the day he died. He said, quote, "I've always wanted to be able to turn on people, and also I've always taken it for granted that if I like something, other people will like it too. The bar world established that kind of feeling. It engulfed me like a little community." And they would listen, among other things, to tales of the Great Strike, because, I mean, that's we're talking, half his customers had been part of it. This was not, this connection to the blue collar history of San Francisco was not casual for him. But the other side and the other aspect of San Francisco, and which I will talk about really for the rest of this talk, which is not so much longer, is the bohemian aspect of San Francisco. The fact that it was a welcome home for bohemians. Obviously, not everybody was all that bohemian. But I'll mention just 2 or 3 examples of things that happened in San Francisco that just could not have happened anywhere else. Well, going back to the very beginning, we're talking about the era of the 1860s when Mark Twain was here, carousing. Bohemia was a term created, connected with people from Czechoslovakia, which I realize, that's the original Bohemia. God knows, many people that didn't have a lot of money and were artistic in Paris in the 1840s lived in a neighborhood that was bohemian. See, this connection is a reach, you'd think. Except it's stuck beautifully for 170 years, so there's some aspect of it that's really true. A guy named Murger wrote a book called Memoirs of Scenes of Life in Bohemia. Became an opera. It became a regular feature of American art. I'm pointing of European art, and by extension American art. Mark Twain and lots of other people, Bret Hart, writers and so forth in San Francisco in particular in the 1860s and after said, yes, this is the way we want to live. As I say, eventually Mark went back east, straightened up. 2 or 3 other things that were going on in San Francisco, or greater San Francisco. We include Berkeley as part of our collective. KPFA, which was founded by, it took me the longest time to realize. Many of you know probably that it's part of actually a chain called the Pacifica Foundation. And I just always thought it had to do with the Pacific Ocean. Well, no, actually they were all World War II pacifists, had paid dues because you were not allowed not to serve. So you were sent off to prison or work camp. And after the war, they settled in the Bay Area, and this group of people created KPFA, which is, an essential part of, again, what made the Bay Area different. It had, among other things, Kenneth Rexroth, that poet I was talking about, had a show in which he would pontificate, and they also had a guy named Alan Watts. Alan Watts was, believe it or not, an Episcopal priest who also knew a great deal about Zen and who ran something called the American Association for Asian Studies. Oddly enough, on Broadway, here in San Francisco, on like the middle of Pacific Heights. Somehow they scammed a building. And through the sort of preaching, as it were, and the preparations of Alan Watts, helped a man named Suzuki Roshi, Shunryo Suzuki, who established the first ongoing Zen monastery in the world outside of Asia, at Tassajara, and the San Francisco Zen Center, which is probably the most powerful introduction of Zen into American life, and has been doing so now for just over 50 years. And always poets, whether it was Rexroth was one of them, and a very powerful one. It's also a man named Robert Duncan, who really, made poetry important, sort of demanded that poetry be part of San Francisco. We have recently seen a lot of stuff about gay marriage. Duncan and his life partner, Jess Collins, quote, took marriage vows, that's how they described it, in 1951 here in San Francisco. So you see, this is not entirely a new thing. And they moved in together at the Ghost House. The Ghost House was an alternative home for artists and crazies They marked it. The geography that they decided was it was halfway between North Beach and the Fillmore because they all love jazz. So it was like conveniently halfway between both. It was at 1350 Franklin, which unfortunately, as a building, doesn't exist anymore. But Philip Lamontia and Wally Hedrick, who's part of this story, in a little I'll talk about in a minute, lived there as well. So the ghost house is really very much part of the psychic history of San Francisco. And there's one other great institution, the California School of Fine Arts, which I forget when, I want to say the 50s. It's called the San Francisco Art Institute now. In 1958, Jerry got to meet the world of Bohemia, even better than a third grade teacher, because he started going to Saturday art classes at the Art Institute. And his teacher was a man named Wally Hedrick. Wally Hedrick had once made a living because Wally had a beard. Nobody had beards in the 50s, you know? The beards were just not done. And Wally got paid to sit in the front window at Vesuvio's by trader Henri Lenoir, who started it, to prove to the passing tourists that this clearly was a beatnik joint, since a guy with a beard was there in the window. Wally, I might add, had even more to do with things than that, and that is that American poetry, you can say in some ways, that the pivotal moment of American poetry in the last 75 years was when Allen Ginsberg read Howl at the Sixth Gallery on Fillmore Street in 1955. He read that poem, and that night happened, the six poets at the Sixth Gallery, mostly because Wally Hedrick, who had been part of the Sixth Gallery with with a group of people that started with Robert Duncan, but he was a little too busy and to get it going, and he said, "Alan, why don't you do it?" And Alan, if ever there was a person who was equipped to be he had the world's best Rolodex, what we would not now anymore. Now it's your directory on your cell phone. But anyway, he had the world's best Rolodex even then, and he could organize anything and organize this what turned into a magical night. The Art Institute was the only school Jerry said he was ever proud of attending. On Saturdays it was called Pre-College Art, and Wally was a fairly well-known funk, which is to say assemblage, multimedia assemblage artist. Had lived up until not long, how many years? Last 5 years, I guess? Anyway, he passed not so long. I guess he moved as far as Bodega, but not too much further. And I might add that well into his 80s, he had a wonderful and charming lady friend who couldn't have been more than 35. I was very proud of him. I thought. Jay was part of that scene, absolutely.
He was with Jane.
Yeah, he had been in the 50s. This is marvelous painter. So, as I say, Wally. Actually, I've left out a name. Wally asked Michael McClure to organize the reading. Michael was too busy. He asked Alan, which was a very smart move, and it all worked. Wally said to Jerry one day, man, that might be more Jerry than Wally, but at any rate, he said, Jerry, you're more beat than I am, because there's all this now. By now, it's 58. On the Road had come out in 1957. Beat was a concept. Grant Avenue, the place, there were beat bars and so forth, and coffee houses and so forth and so on. And Wally said to Jerry, you're way more beat than I am. I want you to go down to City Lights, and I want you to get this book on the road. And he did. The reason I'm sitting in front of you is that's the kind of effect it had on Jerry's life. It was his role model. Kerouac was his role model for what he called my basic beatnik chops. People think of Jerry as a hippie. actually, he was the youngest beatnik, and he would have told you that. He got his sense of ethics of how life was to be lived, what was important, out of City Lights bookstore. I always thought he stole it. I mean, I figured he shoplifted it. Who had the money to buy books? But if so, that it was one of the best investments Lawrence Ferlinghetti ever made. And it completely altered his life. When I finished my Kerouac book, I sent it to Jerry, and literally through the Grateful Dead fan post office box. I mean, I didn't know anybody. I had no connections. And because Eileen Law, a young woman, a wonderful woman who got that mail, was an honorable person. She made damn sure that Jerry got it. And because it was about Kerouac, Jerry read it. And when I met him a couple years later, he basically, he got very extravagant in praise and eventually said, well, why don't you do us? Which I said, fine idea. But as he said, we shared the same prejudices about Kerouac and about the importance of all that. And that, again, that's the gift of being a San Franciscan that he got, and I'd like to think that he certainly gave back. And I really think that that's a very good place to stop. To try and go on and talk about what he gave back to San Francisco is a whole another talk, or three. But the fact is that, just to repeat myself, he was proud of his being a San Franciscan, and that's not something. He was opposed to sentimentality and the idea of being willfully proud of something. It was something he'd be suspicious of, skeptical and cynical about. And the one exception he made was the city of San Francisco. And I think that connects with his grandma. I think it connects with Kerouac. And frankly, I think it connects with everybody in this room because there's all a reason we're here. When I arrived to live in San Francisco in the fall of '76, and Tales of the City was, a daily presence in the paper, which I fell in love. I just thought they were hilarious. And one of the little riffs that Maupin used to talk about was the secret kinship of everybody in San Francisco and Atlantis, because Atlantis too. The cityscape, the skyline of Atlantis was dominated by a pyramid, and it too fell into the ocean. And all the people that took one look, I don't know what the population percentages were, but it seemed in the late 70s as though at least 50% of the citizens of San Francisco were from somewhere else. We were willing pilgrims and volunteers. And one of the reasons, of course, that we came here was old Jerry Giles. So thank you all for coming. Let's see, everybody that wants to flee, feel free. We won't talk about you. And I'm more than happy to answer questions, and if anybody has or comments or whatever. Maybe bad's not the right word, but if you like Frankie Valli and girl groups, well, some of the girl groups are great, but it's still there's not a lot of rawness or depth. It's slick, polished studio stuff, which is how Phil Spector could work his form of magic. Well, they're using that stuff too. So anyway, and so Jerry got into acoustic music and the folk revival, and then very quickly latched onto really the most important effect or music of his life before he started with the Grateful Dead, which was bluegrass. And he played banjo, which is extremely precise. I mean, he may never have, taken lessons, but bluegrass itself, in order to play decently at all, demands precision, especially the banjo. It's a brutal instrument. And it made him. And it made him the guitarist when then, in 1964, you have, in the fall of 1964, his buddy Pigpen, Ron McKernan, said to him, as so many have said to their friends, let's start a band. We can do that. And he was referring to the Rolling Stones' first album. We can do that. We're that good. Actually, Pig was. He was that good. He was at least as good a blues vocalist in 1964 as Mick Jagger was. And so they started a band which became the Warlocks. They'd already been doing jug band music, which was sort of blues with a dance beat. And then they started playing electric blues. And simultaneously they started encountering psychedelics. And then he became the Warlocks. And it's been downhill ever since.
Question is a little outside of the frame of your talk, but it's a pretty fantastic story that's touched on briefly in Phil Lesch's book, his autobiography, and I was wondering if you could verify it.
Lies, all lies. No,
he said that in 87 or 88, after Dylan did his tour with the Dead, he was pretty down and out and asked if he could join the band, and that the band did a vote, and that everybody was for about Dylan joining the Grateful Dead, except for one abstaining vote, and that was Phil, and because it wasn't unanimous, they decided not to let that happen. I just wondered if that's a true story.
well, I didn't go to band meetings. Only band members went to band meetings. I will tell you my story. And all this is I can document because it all happened out in public, virtually. To be honest, I don't remember it the way Phil says. I'd be a little surprised if it got that far. But anyway, what certainly happened was Dylan came to a Los Angeles show. About halfway through he popped up about halfway through the first set, and hung around, at intermission, and said, "Oh yeah, man, love to sit in." And he said, "But I don't want to sing. I'll just play." Well, Bob Dylan really isn't a great guitar player. Plus, he didn't know any Grateful Dead songs. And he's standing on the side of the stage, and they, okay, well, we'll play, and I don't remember the songs, but they play the Grateful Dead song, and he's just sort of standing there, making no great contribution to the music. And they do another Grateful Dead song, and another, and another, and my attitude, now, this may have more to do with me than any member of the band, but my attitude is, the fuck is this guy doing here? I mean, he can't contribute this. It is a quote, which I will argue. It is true that as he walked down, they finally just shrugged and turned it over to the drummers to make some boom boom. And as Phil Lesh left the stage to go take a leak, as he came down the stairs, he said, "What is he doing here?" And I basically said, "Good question, Phil." The story, now the legend is that the next day he said, "Had a great time. Send me some music. I want to join the band." Now after that, I can't imagine that the rest of the Grateful Dead could possibly have taken that as a serious request. And he was. Read Dylan's book Chronicles, and there's another one where you kind of be a little dubious about sources because he talked about rehearsals with the Grateful Dead, which were amazing, at Front Street. It's hysterical because at the same time as the rehearsals, with the NBA Finals, and it involved Bill Walton. So because it was Walton, the band was taking breaks. They never rehearsed much anyway, and watching Walton, and Dylan didn't care about basketball, so he'd go out in the parking lot, which was in front of, in fact, of the building, and sit. And Front Street in San Rafael in the late 80s was a major site of prostitution. And so all the hookers would be across the street going, "See, that's him, that's him." And they'd be pointing at Dylan, and he'd just be sitting there, sort of being Dylan. But he wrote in his book Chronicles. He wrote about going up to the bar at the end of the block, and there was a barn grill restaurant. For all I know, it's still there. Yeah, good cheeseburgers. We got our lunch there quite frequently, and talked about hearing a black blues man, sing there, and it reminded him that it was all about music, and he should soldier on, and because he just sort of hit a hollow spot in his life. The problem with that, of course, is that there was never, ever, ever any live entertainment. Now, I assume that he had the same experience, but it would have been it just didn't make such a good story to talk about listening to a record and having that thought. So he had to pop it up a little. But anyway, so the answer is, all I can say is the Grateful Dead played their best, on the off nights, on the in those weird gigs where when the going got tough, the Grateful Dead folded almost every time. When it was Woodstock, Monterey Pop. How'd you like to be in between Pete Townsend and Jimi Hendrix? Destruction derby of the instruments plus the lighting the guitar on fire. There's Jerry playing away. No. Actually, one critic said it was probably the best guitar playing of the weekend, but who would ever remember it? The point being that the Grateful Dead were not performers in that sense. They went up on stage and they let you in on their life, and on a great night, and they have great nights, as we all know. But it was one of the true tragedy, but it made me so sad. The summer of 1987, this is the Grateful Dead, this 1 year after Jerry almost died. He's glad he's alive. The rest of the band's glad he's alive. Everybody's glad they're alive. They're all about as healthy as they ever were gonna be, including him. And Dylan was a drunk. And by the way, the greatest single living musician in terms of material that they worshipped. And one out of we played 6 nights, and one of them was a contender, in New York City. I don't know where it was. Just that. Well, it's actually New Jersey, but anyway, the New York City gig was just close enough to the city to feel the mojo or something. They did Chimes of Freedom flashing, and I thought, wow, because this was the second show. They'd been I think it was the second. They'd done Boston. It was like, and unfortunately, all the rest were, I just remember watching Dylan throw a tantrum because he was wearing white plastic cowboy boots, and it was in Eugene. It rained. It was muddy, and he was like screaming that they had to lay down some boards outside his dressing room so that he didn't mess up his boots. Sorry, odd memories. First, and then you.
So he grew up with a Latin name and a Latin neighborhood. Did he have any?
Well, no. Remember, this was Irish Catholic neighborhood at the time in the 40s. And I'm sorry, did he have any Latin roots?
Any Latin identity or roots?
Not to speak of.
Just the name.
Just the name.
From Spain, right?
I'm sorry, from Spain, exactly. So his grandfather was from Spain. Joe Garcia, his father, as far as I can tell, was played American big band music, and as Jerry said, he was a genre musician like I am, but not Latin genre. So no, not as far as I can tell. He certainly. I mentioned that when he was in Barcelona in 1981, he was blown away because he could understand, because it sounded like his grandfather. But that's about it.
I'm embarrassed to ask this question, but you mentioned the bohemian beatnik scene in San Francisco, and I've seen it in movies so much with the beatniks, instead of clapping.
Yeah.
Did they actually do that?
It was they'd snap fingers. It was clapping was considered uncool. I believe that is true specifically at a place called The Place, which was a coffee house on Grant. And on Monday night, I think it was Monday nights, they had something called Blabbermouth Night, where anybody, no matter how lame, could get up and recite, presumably claim to be reciting poetry, even if it was, gibberish. And the traditional response to that was, yeah. So.
How many children did Jerry have?
We know of 4. All girls. The man bred true. And they all look like him. So we're confident that they're his daughters. There's no question about it. They all also happen to be extremely nice people. They have that part too.
Trixie's very beautiful.
And Trixie's gorgeous.
She organized that symphony tour.
Yep. And then, well, that's in the last I don't know year, as I'm sure most of you know, Jerry dies. He didn't plan on dying, so few do, and as a result, he did some. Plus, he had a very bad lawyer, and he did some stunningly stupid things with his will. One of which was to have one of the main what's the word I'm looking for? Beneficiaries, thank you. Beneficiaries also be the executrix, namely Deborah, which is just conflict of interest there is like rife. So anyway, much storm, much drama, much bullshit, and eventually the legal situation is such that any heir can pretty much do what they want, as long as they share the money. And some 6 months or a year ago, Trixie, Teresa, said, "I'll do it for the daughters." The daughters are all on one side of this, along with Tiff, Jerry's brother, and she has gotten a very competent music management company and so they've re-energized the Jerry Garcia. I hate to say this, brand, and one of the first fruits of that is Warren's symphonic tour, and there'll be more. I think Jerry spent a lot of time. Jerry's eldest daughter, who was born in 1961, and I'm just now pulled a blank. Oh my God!
Heather.
Thank you, ma'am. Heather, whose mother was Sarah, lovely woman. Jerry was 19. He was never really good at being a husband or a father. Sure as hell wasn't at the age of 19. But anyway, Heather is a classical violinist, and one of Jerry's projects that he had me running around, basically running in circles for various reasons, late in his life, was to do essentially what Warren did, except he wanted to do it with original music. In other words, he was going to commission a number of pieces for guitar and symphony, so that he could play with his daughter, which I thought, that's the reason I got involved, even though I was going, Jerry, okay, we're looking at this. I'm not the most experienced guy, but I'm seeing, say $100,000 right now for basic expenses. You gonna put that up? We'll figure that out, man. Okay. So.
Did he have a time when he felt prosperous and at ease, or was it always like sort of monetary struggles?
Oh no, I mean, yeah, touch of gray. When he bought that 16-cylinder, I guess it was a Beamer still, but it was the ultimate top of the line, whatever it was.
I thought that was the ice cream wagon. I thought that was the Ben and Jerry's money, that car.
No, they didn't. He didn't make that kind of money from Ben and Jerry's. No, that was post Touch of Grey. I mean, the money rolled in for a while, and everybody bought cars and everybody enjoyed it. But Jerry, I'm sorry.
He bought a Bentley when his first solo album.
Yeah. So no, he bought it. He bought the house and got the down payment for the house in Stinson Beach with his first solo album. That check. Ask Mountain Girl about that check. That was an important check in her life. That was a wonderful house. If you ever seen pictures of that house, nothing until Japan. It's just an amazing view. But money, Jerry's. Freud said that money is like, pardon the language, but this is free speech hour. It's like shit, okay? Which is to say, and we all know in our digestive tracts, that if you try to hold on to things, you will get ill. I can think of one shining example of the Grateful Dead doing a gig for the money. stupid money. And it was stupid money. And it was the US Festival in 1982. And Bill Graham at the last, this again, Steve Wozniak of Apple had sort of gotten seduced by, as I understand it, they were either est people or sort of like est, but that sort of mind. What's the score?
We're down, I'm sorry.
Oh, too bad.
It's been on by itself.
Yeah, well, it does that all the time. And they would anyway. So he had to put on this US. He felt called to put on the US Festival, and it was a catastrophe. And at the last second, they brought in Bill Graham to save it, and Bill naturally picked up the phone and said, "Come on, you guys got to play this festival." And I think they paid him $250,000, which in 1982 was a ton of money. And of course, what it ended up being was at 9 o'clock in the morning, breakfast in bed with the Grateful Dead. Well, the Grateful Dead being the Grateful Dead in those days, we're talking about 1982, nobody went to bed. And they played Mets and Mets. It certainly wasn't inspired, shall we say. And they agreed that it was, I remember having a great conversation with Kreutzmann in particular about it, just saying, we always said, don't do gigs for the money, and we did it, and pissed our time away. So, it's a lesson they learned early, and they learned it from Jerry and Hunter. Yes, ma'am?
I feel like through the years as to whether Jerry felt any kind of inner peace before his life ended, or at any point.
I think it came in, it comes and it goes. I do think, frankly, that he felt a great, as far as his drug problems went, and keep in mind, the drugs didn't kill him, they kept him going. It was the cheeseburgers and the cigarettes and the general, he pretended to be exercising, and Susanna, my wife, once came back to our hotel room in Boston and said, I have, the earth may end today. I said, what? She said, there's 4 members of the Grateful Dead are in the gym now. And it was well before noon. The problem was, I watched Jerry, because by then I had become, by 91, starting in around that time, that's when I finally got the workout bug. I'd be pumping away, and he'd come in, and he'd fiddly fuck around for 10 minutes. Great workout! So, but anyway, so the inner peace, though, I have always, the night Jerry died, it was not the best day of my life, and that evening, after I announced to the press, and I think we had 12 TV trucks in the parking lot across the street from the office. Afterward, I turned to the tour manager, Cameron, and I said, "There's only one thing to do now. Get up off your ass. Come on, we're gonna go get a drink." And Cameron's more than a little bit of a tight ass about that. He was like, "Oh, well, I guess so." And we had a couple of pops, and we looked at each other, and the one thing the thing we could say is, it wasn't a hotel room. We didn't want him to. That would have felt crummy. He died. I joked about it, and this is like a little sappy, but it's the way I feel. It was as though, he'd gone down to the Betty Ford clinic. Why those dumb motherfuckers never bothered to take his blood pressure, I'll never know, but that's another lawsuit that should have been done. And he had largely, broken his actual physical dependence. But he knew that he had to make a complete effort that was way beyond just not doing drugs. It was digging down deeper than that. which is why he decided, to go to whatever that place was in Marin, West Marin. And I have said, it's a little sappy, but I think it's true, that on some cellular level, his body said, okay, he's made the decision. We're clear on that. But this whole body is, I mean, the diet, people are supposed to have a sugar thing around 100. His was at 220. Think what happened to his lungs. We're talking 40 years of cigarettes. How many years of smoking drugs? Anyway, and his body said, this is okay. Now we can check out. And he did. And as probably many of you know, he died with an enormous grin on his face. So, that's as good as I can answer.
Did Jerry shoot heroin or smoke heroin?
No, smoked. It was called in those days as a way of jerking yourself off. It was called purge. It wasn't called heroin. Ooh, not heroin. Yeah. Persian opium, which which it wasn't, but it wasn't opium. But anyway, stuff. Yeah. Anyway, somebody else? Yeah.
So all his good friends, you seem to be pretty close, I don't want to be negative, but he had a severe drug addiction. Besides the diabetes, he could afford the best chefs. He could have been taken care of very well. What was his...
If he'd been willing.
No. But what was his... He had control over everybody that cared about him. Because he could have said...
Because he was more stubborn than anybody around him. That's correct.
Leo's.
Okay. So was it somebody poured heroin? And I always get this story. Somebody poured heroin into the place where he was in West Marin, and that's...
No, I saw that article in one of those tabloids. No.
No, he just...
No, he died of a heart attack. Finally had a heart attack, which, I mean, the man was a poster child for having a heart attack.
Yeah, really.
He didn't get exercise, he was overweight, he smoked, No, he had straight, honest-to-God heart attack, which is exactly what and of course, because of fame and everything else, he had to have an autopsy, and that's what he died of.
And what was his drug of choice?
Stop.
Pretty much whatever's in front of him at the moment. I mean, he loved cocaine and purge, and he drank too much. Not too much, but he would drink these really disgusting, super sweet.
Myers rum and coke.
Or that what do you call it? The toxic spill. It was the chocolate stuff.
Yeah.
Kahlua, a lot of Kahlua. Oh.
Myers rum and coke. Nasty.
Did the rest of the band make any effort to rein him in?
Yes.
Or look any other way?
Yes,
Were they
many times.
in there with him? Or
I don't know. I suspect that, I mean, everybody in this room that's been at it longer than a week has lost a friend to addiction, and I don't know how much time and energy you spent trying to convince that person that they were going down the wrong path, and Jerry Garcia was charismatic in the sense that everybody around him fell in love with him, pretty much. Wanted to be led by him. He could lead. He was a leader, even though he didn't want to be the leader. He was the leader, even though he didn't want to be the boss. That's what he said. People accepted this. Even natural authoritarians, like Phil Lesh, for instance, that's his natural personality. For 30 years, I almost feel sorry for him. For 30 years, he had to accept that it was always going to be slightly chaotic and anarchistic around the Grateful Dead, because that's the style that Jerry set. And it worked, and you couldn't mess with that. And so so he was incredibly strong that way. And inversely, he had, and I could go into psychobiography at some length, but he had some major self-esteem problems, which related a lot to his mom, feeling unworthy. Some some basic, just, too much pressure. I mean, there were 50 people whose paychecks immediately around him, and we all had family, and that includes me. I'm part of that pressure, and everybody else that got a paycheck, and a million deadheads, all of whom demanded, by God, at least 80 concerts a year, or they weren't getting fed what they wanted. All that stuff, weighed on him, and band members, there were interventions, and there were this, and there was that, and John Kahn, who also had drug problems, once said to Jerry, and they've been playing together, they were partners, and Jerry very much loved John. They've been playing together for years, and one time, there were some bad nights at the Garcia band, where they were just, Jerry would, God, Keystone, Berkeley, I mean, he'd finally come on at 11, play 35 minutes, go back off for an hour and a half, play another 20 minutes, and call it a night. This is not respecting your audience or your music. And one night, John, basically, as a way of trying to start a conversation, said, we haven't been playing very well lately. And Jerry's response, to John's considerable shock, was, yeah, you're right, we should just fold it. Let's just fold it. And it was like, because Jerry knew what was coming. And, and it was like, you got to clean up, man. Well, let's all clean up together, which actually would have been a great idea. But again, it wasn't the drugs that killed him. What he needed to clean up was his entire lifestyle. I mean, he was a 55-year-old guy acting like he was still 18. You could get away with that at 18. He wasn't all that overweight either at 18. But, and frankly, the drugs he was doing at 18 were not going to hurt him terribly. That's a whole other story. But the fact is that he did not, most of us, I was always thin and it didn't bother me, and then I quit drugs and I quit cigarettes, and one day, long story short, I realized, oh my God, I'm gaining weight for the first time. And fortunately, I had a wife and a daughter who been laughing at me and said, it's time for you to go to the gym. And I went, well, yes, you're right. Oh, shit. And I've been there ever since, because most of us recognize, God damn it, we aren't the exception to the rule. And, you have to do this stuff if you care to not only live a long time, but hopefully live, reasonably well past 50 or 60. He wasn't playing that game. And he wouldn't do any of that stuff. He wanted to be Huck Finn on a raft, with a fat joint in his mouth and a pretty girl, playing guitar to her. That was sort of his image of himself.
It's exercise.
Huh? At least for the fingers. So
if what you've been trying to say is that he did not die of an overdose, that he was clean?
he's certainly not. Yeah, I haven't been trying to say that. I've said that. He died of a heart attack. Period.
A lot has been written about how the pressures of the Grateful Dead in those final years, and even Jerry experiencing some levels of boredom with the Grateful Dead. I'm curious if there's any indication if the scenario had been set to where the Grateful Dead organization would have had the freedom to take whatever time would have been needed for Jerry's health or any other considerations, what do you think Jerry would have done for peace and what would have interested him at that time? I can
He would have taken the Garcia band out on the road and done the same goddamn thing he'd been doing.
Okay.
That was the assumption.
Okay.
We didn't think of that as an option.
Sure.
And I don't think anybody would have objected to, severe pay cuts to survive, a year without performing, if there had been any sense that it would have an impact on him, I don't think you would have seen a lot of problem with that. It's just, if you get through life and you never have a friend that you lose to drug addiction, God has blessed you. But most of us have experienced that, and it isn't just him. You can't do anything about it until you decide you want to do something about it. And I think he got to that place in August of 1995. Unfortunately, by then his body said it was too late. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that Jerry wasn't sentimental about anything except for San Francisco.
Pretty much.
Any idea what he would think or feel about all the festivities surrounding Jerry Week?
You know, I tell you, I had not heard the expression as it applied. The days between. I just read that in today's paper, yesterday's paper, and it's true. I love that song, and I was, but I on the other hand, I'm contributing. Here we are. I've enjoyed Jerry Day. Again, at Jerry Garcia Amphitheater and Melvin and Stu and I thoroughly enjoyed it because it has no pretensions and no, it's just a little family neighborhood gathering. God knows he's among the more important presences of my life, and I cherish the time. Hey, it was the one thing I wanted to do was follow up the Kerouac book with a book about the Grateful Dead. I decided that in 1973, and it took me 7 years to get, to have lightning strike and have him say that. So he gave me a major turn in my life. I could also say, be careful what you wish for. There were some consequences there for a while. But the point being that he'd be embarrassed. When they put his name in the stars in front of Bill Graham Civic on the sidewalk, Bobby went to the ceremony, bless him, and said, "Well, I don't quite know what I'm doing." It's words to the effect, "I don't know what I'm doing here because Jerry would never have permitted this." Of course, Deborah was sitting there saying, "Oh, Jerry would be so proud." No. On this one, trust Bobby.
It's like when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
He wouldn't show. Exactly. Of that, I will say, what shocked me was not that he wouldn't go.
But that the rest of them went.
That the rest of them went, and B, that Deborah did not want to go. Because pardon me, but a lot of the motion behind that was wives wanting to get dressed up and go to the Waldorf. They were really excited about that. I remember, and as I say, my first reaction was, they're never gonna go. What, the Grateful Dead? Jerry, one of the greatest compliment I ever got from Jerry, or one of two that I will always cherish, but was, 1987 we put out Touch of Grey. March, I guess it was, of 1988, the Bammies, Grateful Dead, of course, the bands know who's won, and it was obvious who was going to win everything, and so we get invited, they want us to play, they want us, and Jerry, awards, the whole concept of awards in music was like, wait a minute, that makes it competition, some win, some get awards and win, and some... No, does not process. Null set. And he was like, no. And I went to the band. I said, well, they want to do this, they want to do that, and they want to do this, and some of the band were going, yeah, and Jerry was going, I don't know, and I was saying, well, man, it's a matter of noblesse oblige. Your community wants to say thank you to you. That's what it's about, So he said, oh, okay. And I was standing on the back steps of the Civic Auditorium waiting for him. And finally he pulled up and he looked at me and he said, man, I just couldn't figure out how I could leave you holding the bag, because I do not want to be here. Now, one of the reasons was that, for instance, because it was 20 bands, and he couldn't have his own. He had his own instrument, but he couldn't have his own amps. Stuff like that, which as a musician was just the kind of thing that would set his teeth on edge. But and like I say, the whole concept of awards and it just so he was consistent about it all.
I think I remember reading somewhere that they paid the rent at the Chelsea Hotel for Herbert Huncke at the end of his life.
They might have helped Huncke, but in particular, it was Harry Smith.
Okay.
Yes. Oh no.
How did that come about, and can you elaborate
I did
on
that.
a little bit? Oh, okay.
Well, not really. Because of Kerouac, I know all the beats. And Harry had been sleeping on Allen Ginsberg's couch for months or years. And Allen came to a show at the Garden and said, because the Rex Foundation had by now started, and Allen said, "Dennis, you got to get me to Jerry. I got to talk to him about Harry Smith." Well, for those of you who don't know, Harry Smith was an extraordinary human being who, I might add, lived in San Francisco for a long time, very much part of our ethos, and did many bizarre things in his life. And one of them was he had a fantastic collection of 78s. And in 1953, he moved back to New York and he went to Folkways. I'm pulling blanks. Moash. He went to Moash at Folkways and said, "Mo, buy my record collection." And Mo said, "Nah, I don't think so. Not so much. But tell you what, why don't you cull the best out of it, and we'll put together what became known as the
American Songbook.
no, but close.
American folk music.
I'm sorry, the Anthology of American Folk Music. Thank you. And it was 82 cuts, completely illegal. I'm pretty sure. I don't think they took care of one permission. And these were all records, professionally recorded records from the period after electric microphones were created, which was 1926, 7, and in that period, anyway, until the record industry basically imploded during the Depression for about 2 years, say in 1931. And during those 3 or 4 years, and he put together a 6-album, 82-song collection of songs, where Jerry and Bob Dylan and every other folkie of this was their Bible. Remember, very interesting, Bob Dylan had never heard of Robert Johnson until after he signed with Columbia. John Hammond gave him, in a white jacket, it was pre-release, a copy of the first broadly distributed Robert Johnson album, which was called King of the Delta Blues. It was about half the cuts that he recorded. I think he recorded 26, right? Then there's the mythical 27. So this had like the first 12 or 13 songs. In 1961, there's no internet, there's no CD libraries, there's no, 20 people in America knew who Robert Johnson was. Heavy-duty, serious collectors who had 78s and who had worked to find those 78s because, there weren't that many that were made. And Dylan, writes about this in Chronicles, and it's like just one of the electric moments where his ears met this incredible voice with this incredible guitar technique and just flipped out. But keep in mind, there's that really annoying commercial, because I watch a lot of baseball, and there's this commercial constantly where the two 12-year-old boys are talking about kids these days. They don't know how easy they have it because of the Blu-ray TV where you can take it anywhere. And I was going, well, kids these days have no clue how much they have. They do know. They have access to everything. And that's remarkably different from 1961. So, so have I wandered by any chance? Yes, I have. So, to finish the Harry Smith story, Alan wanted to get rid of him off his couch. I walked him into I said, "Hey, Jerry, Alan wants to talk to you." Jerry said, "Shh, Sure, man. Alan goes in and gets a 3-year commitment, $10,000 a year. It was the biggest single commitment Rex ever made. 3 years at 10, usually we did 5. Either 5 or 10, but if it was 10, it was once. Harry got 3 times 10. And Jerry just said, what are you kidding me? I owe the guy. Absolutely, instantly. Easiest negotiation ever done. He knew. He wanted to pay his dues.
Dennis, thanks for coming to Librarians Asking.
Please.
Take one more question from Karen Hemer.
I would be happy to take one more question.
School Jerry, and is one of the founders of Jerry Tech.
Thank you. Thank you for the founding.
Co-founding, actually.
Okay.
I knew Jerry from kindergarten. I was in the first grade, he was in kindergarten. We were about 6 months apart in school because we used to have 6-month terms.
Right.
And we went to school together until he left Balboa High School.
Wow.
And, we weren't best friends or anything, but we knew each other, and we saw each other every day. I used to go to the Granada Theater on Saturdays, just like he did.
There you go.
We ran into each other. And a few years ago, a bunch of us got together and after the Jerry Day founding and decided that his name ought to be on the amphitheater up there. And hopefully he wouldn't have been embarrassed about that because it was his neighborhood that came together.
That's what I thought when I heard about it.
And I thought it was important to bring it up because there is a move afoot to try to get his name off that amphitheater. And of course, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. And we hope
So
have everybody's help to make sure whatever,
It's a-
whatever happens, there might be a
Start an online
there
petition.
might be, we don't know what's coming up.
yeah, the president seems to have gone away. This is foundation that
Yeah.
blah blah blah. But anyway,
So keep your eyes and ears out, and we may need everybody's help to try to keep the name out.
I don't think you'll have much problem with that. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, I was wondering what time closing time was.